You will be shocked by what I am about to tell you. After 12 long months stationed in Afghanistan, I was finally going home. I'd seen things out there that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Things no man should ever have to see. But through it all, the thought of returning to Emily kept me grounded. She was my rock, my reason to push forward when it felt like the world was falling apart. The plane touched down at the base, and the familiar sight of American soil brought a flood of relief. I'd missed everything. Home-cooked meals, the smell of pine trees after the rain, and most of all, my wife. I'd written her letters every week, and her replies had been my lifeline. Every word reminded me of why I was fighting. When I stepped off the transport bus in my small Tennessee town, my heart was pounding. I hadn't told Emily I was coming home early. I wanted to surprise her, to see the look on her face when I walked through that door. My duffel bag slung over my shoulder, I hailed a cab and gave the driver my address. The ride felt like it lasted forever, though it was only 15 minutes. As we pulled up to the house, I saw the front porch light glowing faintly in the evening dusk. It was warm and inviting, just as I remembered. I paid the driver, grabbed the flowers I'd picked up on the way, and made my way to the door. I didn't knock. I didn't want to give her a chance to prepare for my arrival. I slid my key into the lock and stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. No TV playing in the background, no sound of footsteps or the faint hum of music from the kitchen. "Emily?" I called out, setting my bag down near the door. No answer. I wandered into the living room. Everything was as I'd left it, down to the framed photos of us on the mantel. A smile tugged at the corner of my lips as I picked one up, a picture of us at the lake 2 summers ago. Her smile had been radiant that day, the sunlight bouncing off her blonde hair. "Emily?" I called again, this time louder. Still nothing. Maybe she'd gone to the store, or maybe she was out with friends. I set the photo back down and glanced around the room again, scanning for anything out of place. A soldier's instinct never really shuts off, even at home. The house smelled faintly of lavender, like the candle Emily always loved burning. There was a glass of wine on the coffee table, the red liquid still fresh. I moved through the living room toward the kitchen, my boots landing heavier than usual on the hardwood floor. My eyes caught small details, an empty plate in the sink, a man's shoes by the back door. I stopped. My mind processed the sight like a slow-moving wave. They were men's loafers, polished and pristine. Not mine. Not the kind of shoes anyone would leave if they just stopped by to fix the sink or drop something off. Still gripping the bouquet of flowers, I tightened my jaw and turned toward the stairs. My military training surged through me, reminding me to breathe evenly, think clearly. The creak of the steps beneath my boots was the only sound as I ascended. At the top of the stairs, I saw our bedroom door cracked open. A faint light spilled into the dark hallway. I walked toward it, steady and deliberate, my heart steady as if this were any other mission. I reached the door and pushed it open with the toe of my boot. The scene in front of me wasn't what I expected, but it was worse. Emily was standing near the dresser, her back to me, wearing nothing but her robe. Another man, shirtless, leaned against the bed frame, smirking like he owned the place. A smugness that set fire to my veins. He didn't even flinch when he saw me standing there. He spoke with an air of smugness, casually remarking on my arrival as though he were greeting an old friend, calling me the hero returning in a tone that made my blood boil. Emily turned abruptly, her face drained of color, as though she'd just encountered a ghost. She looked at me with wide eyes, panic creeping into her voice. "Ethan, oh my God, I didn't know." I asked her, my voice low and controlled despite the fury simmering beneath the surface, what it was she didn't know. Was it that I'd come back? That I'd discover everything? The man chuckled, crossing his arms with an air of confidence, as though he had nothing to fear. He told me not to take it personally, calling me soldier, and said things happen. I'd been gone a long time, he added, and she was a lonely woman. The audacity, the absolute gall of this man standing in my home, speaking to me like I was the intruder. My fists tightened at my sides, but I didn't step forward. "Not yet," Emily stammered, tears welling in her eyes as she tried to explain, insisting it wasn't what I thought. I snapped, cutting her off, and told her it was exactly what I thought. Then I demanded she tell me exactly how long it had been going on. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked to the man for help, but he just shrugged, his smirk unwavering. I barked at her not to look at him, demanding she focus on me instead. And for the first time, I saw it. The guilt, the shame, the cracks in the woman I thought I knew. But instead of crumbling, I felt something else rise inside me. Cold rage. I told her she was going to explain herself, stepping further into the room as I demanded she do it immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's eyes darted from me to the man, who still hadn't moved from his relaxed position against the bed frame. My mind raced, calculating every possible explanation for how this had happened. The Emily I knew, or thought I knew, would never betray me like this. I demanded an answer from Emily, my voice sharp enough to cut through steel. Finally, her trembling voice broke the silence as she admitted she hadn't meant for this to happen. It just had. I cut her off sharply, refusing to hear any more, and took another step into the room. Turning my attention to the man, I demanded to know his name. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by my tone, and introduced himself casually as Cole, like we were meeting at a barbecue. I repeated his name, letting it roll off my tongue like poison, before giving him 10 seconds to explain what the hell he was doing in my house. Cole smirked again, the kind of smirk that made my fists itch. He shrugged casually and explained that he was there because she had invited him. I stared at him, the word, invited, echoing in my mind. My blood boiled, but I kept my voice steady as I asked if she had invited him into my home, into my bed. Cole shrugged nonchalantly, admitting she hadn't mentioned the bed part until later. Then, with a lazy grin, he added that he wasn't one to pry into someone else's drama. I moved faster than I'd anticipated, closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. Before I knew it, I had him by the collar, dragging him upright. His smug expression finally faltered, replaced with a flicker of fear. Emily cried out, rushing forward, pleading for me to stop. I warned Emily to stay back, my grip tightening as I stared into Cole's eyes. For the first time, he looked less sure of himself. I asked him if he thought this was funny, if he really believed he could just waltz into a soldier's home and disrespect me like this. Cole sputtered, his cocky demeanor slipping as he quickly tried to explain that he hadn't known I'd be back so soon. I said, my voice ice cold, that it was clearly the case. I released him, shoving him back onto the bed. I told him he had 5 minutes to get out of my house before I forgot my training and did something I'd regret. Cole scrambled to his feet, grabbing his shirt from the floor and muttering that he was leaving, his bravado completely gone. As he brushed past Emily, she grabbed his arm, saying they needed to talk. I told her sharply to let him go, adding that she and I weren't done. Cole hesitated for a moment, then turned and left the room. I listened to the sound of his footsteps retreating down the stairs and the front door slamming shut. When I turned back to Emily, her face was pale, and her hands were trembling. She started to speak, but I cut her off, telling her she was going to explain everything to me. My voice was low and controlled as I told her not to dare lie to me, not now. Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't feel pity. Not yet. Not after what I just walked into. Her voice broke as she started to explain, telling me it wasn't supposed to be like this and that she hadn't known how to tell me, but I wasn't having it. I demanded to know what she meant. If she was trying to say that she couldn't wait a year for me to come home, that she decided to shack up with some lowlife while I was risking my life overseas. Her lip quivered, but she held my gaze. She told me it wasn't just about him, that it was more complicated than that, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook. I crossed my arms and told her to make me understand, because from where I was standing, it seemed pretty damn simple. She hesitated, as if weighing her next words carefully, and then she said something that knocked the wind out of me. I could barely process what she was saying. I demanded to know what she meant, my voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and rage. Her voice trembled as she confessed, telling me there had been others, that it wasn't just Cole. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing, struggling to wrap around her words. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, her voice trembling as she admitted that it started after I left. She was lonely, she confessed, and didn't know how to handle being alone. I couldn't hold back anymore. My voice rose as I confronted her, fury surging through me. I told her that she couldn't blame me for what happened. I had been out there, fighting for our future, for her. And now, she was telling me that she couldn't keep it together for just one damn year. The weight of it all hit me, and the words came out harsher than I'd intended. Her silence was answer enough. I turned and paced the room, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. This wasn't just betrayal. It was something deeper, something darker. And as I looked back at Emily, I realized I didn't know this woman at all. I asked her, my voice strained, why she hadn't just told me that she couldn't handle it. Why hadn't she ended things before it spiraled this far? She shook her head, her body trembling as she cried. She whispered that she didn't know how to handle it, that she thought she could fix things before I came back. But it was too late to fix anything. I stared at her, my chest heaving as I tried to process the mess unraveling before me. Her excuses didn't add up. They weren't enough. Fix things? What did that even mean? How could she have possibly thought that bringing strangers into our home, into our bed, was fixing anything? The room felt too small, the air too thin. I needed space, clarity, something to pull me out of this spiral. But before I could say another word, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside caught my attention. I froze, my senses sharpening, a habit born from years of training. Emily's tear-streaked face turned toward the window, her expression shifting from guilt to confusion. My gut told me something else was about to drop, and I wasn't sure if I could handle it. A heavy knock rattled the front door. My pulse quickened. Who the hell could it be now? Emily looked at me, her eyes wide with panic. She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, swearing that she didn't know who that was. I didn't trust her, not anymore. Ignoring her protests, I stormed down the stairs, my heart pounding as the knocking turned into relentless pounding. Whoever was on the other side wasn't leaving anytime soon. I swung the door open, ready to unleash whatever frustration was still bubbling over. But what I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a woman, middle-aged, well-dressed, but her face was twisted with anger. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and her piercing eyes locked onto me like I was the source of all her problems. The woman demanded to know where she was, pushing past me without waiting for an invitation. I blinked, stunned by her audacity, and stepped in front of her to block her path. I was taken aback by her boldness, unsure how to react, so I asked her what she thought she was doing. She glared at me, her voice rising as she demanded that I not play dumb. She claimed that she knew Emily was here and insisted on talking to her right away. Behind me, I heard Emily's footsteps rushing down the stairs. "Janet!" she called out, her voice cracking. Janet spun around, her anger shifting into something even more dangerous, contempt. I could feel the weight of her words as she spat them out, asking if she thought she could get away with it. The accusation was sharp, biting, and I could sense the fury in her voice, making it clear that this was far from over. I stepped between them, my patience completely gone, burned up in the fire of everything I'd already endured that night. I demanded to know what she was talking about, my voice sharp with frustration. Janet ignored me completely, her attention fixed solely on Emily. She accused Emily of lying to her brother, of lying to all of them, and then demanded to know how she thought she could keep hiding here. Her brother? My mind scrambled to connect the dots, and then it hit me. Janet was talking about Cole. Emily's face turned ghostly pale, and I could hear the tremor in her voice as she begged Janet to let her explain. Janet let out a harsh laugh, shaking her head. She told Emily that she was going to explain, but it would be to her husband. She seemed certain that he already knew everything, and that they had been putting the pieces together all along. I cut her off, my voice sharp with confusion and rising anger. I demanded to know what her husband had to do with any of this. Janet's eyes locked onto mine, filled with an almost unbearable weight of pity. She spoke softly, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. Emily had been seeing her husband too. The revelation sent shockwaves through me, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt sideways. My knees threatened to give out, but I steadied myself against the doorframe, my grip so tight my knuckles ached. I turned to Emily, my voice low and dangerous as I asked if what Janet had said was true. My gaze was intense, filled with the weight of everything that had been building up. I demanded to know if she was really seeing Janet's husband, just like Janet had claimed. Her silence said everything. I stared at Emily, my disbelief and anger simmering. I muttered under my breath, the words slipping out before I could contain them. It was hard to fathom everything she had kept hidden. I couldn't help but feel sickened. I couldn't believe it. There had to be more I didn't know. I asked myself, was there anyone you weren't screwing around with while I was gone? Janet stepped forward, her anger still simmering. She made it clear that I wasn't the only one hurt in this situation. Her words hit me like a slap. She told me that Emily had been tearing apart her family, all while pretending to be some poor, lonely wife. And with that, she made it clear. My pity party was over. Emily sobbed, collapsing onto the bottom step of the staircase. But I couldn't bring myself to care. The betrayal, the lies, the sheer audacity of it all. It was too much. I looked at Janet, whose fury mirrored my own. I told her flatly that she needed to leave. This was my house, and I needed to deal with Emily alone. Janet hesitated, clearly reluctant, but eventually nodded. She said that it was fine, but warned me not to let Emily weasel her way out of this. According to her, Emily wasn't the victim here, no matter how hard she tried to play that part. She turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I turned back to Emily, who was now a trembling, tear-soaked mess on the stairs. Part of me wanted to yell, to scream, to tear the whole damn house apart. But another part of me, the part that had spent years learning to stay calm under pressure, knew I needed answers. I crossed my arms, my voice cold and steady, and demanded that Emily start talking. All of it. Now, as Emily sat there, her hands trembling as she wiped the tears from her face, the weight of everything in the room was suffocating. Her silence crushed me, but I couldn't let it linger. I needed her to speak, needed to hear the truth, even if it would burn every last thread of what was left of my trust. I said again, my voice barely above a whisper but cold and full of authority, urging her to speak. I needed the truth, every detail, and I wasn't about to let her leave anything out. She choked on a sob, but before she could answer, the sound of tires screeching outside snapped my attention away from her. My head snapped toward the window, and I instinctively moved closer to the door, ready for anything. This night had been a whirlwind of surprises, and nothing seemed impossible anymore. Another car. The engine cut off with a heavy thud, and I saw the headlights flicker out through the curtains. Footsteps followed shortly after. They were heavy, deliberate steps. I could already feel my chest tightening again. Janet's eyes narrowed as she looked at me and hissed, asking who the hell this was. Before I could answer, the knock came. A single, forceful pound that rattled the entire door. Without thinking, I reached for the handle and swung it open, fully prepared for whatever was on the other side. And there he was. A man, mid-30s maybe, dressed in an unbuttoned jacket, his face a mix of exhaustion and hope. His eyes darted past me, searching the house, and I could feel the tension crawling up my spine. There was something about him, something familiar, but off. I wasn't sure yet, but my instincts were already working overtime. He said he was there to see Emily, his voice uncertain and almost apologetic, as if he wasn't sure whether he was crossing a line. His eyes finally found hers, and his face softened with a genuine smile. But it didn't last. His gaze flickered toward the silence in the room as he saw the three of us standing there. And then he froze. His smile faltered, and confusion spread across his face. He asked what was going on, stepping back slightly as he looked between Janet and me. I didn't answer right away. My eyes were locked on Emily, who looked like she might faint right there in the doorway. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her hands trembled in her lap, her knees pulled up to her chest like she was trying to curl in on herself. The man said Emily's name again, his voice tinged with worry as he asked if she was okay. This time, she managed a strangled, almost inaudible sound. Her head was shaking, barely enough to be noticed, but I saw it. I saw the truth in her actions even before she spoke. I stepped forward, my voice low and filled with anger as I demanded to know who he was and what he thought he was doing here. He repeated that he was just there to see Emily, but this time his words lacked certainty. He went on to explain that she had told him she didn't have anyone, that she was alone. Janet's face twisted in anger as she stepped forward. She glared at the man, her voice filled with fury as she said that Emily had lied to him too, pretending to be alone all this time. The man's eyes widened as the truth slowly settled into him. His jaw clenched as his mind pieced it all together, slowly but surely. His gaze turned toward Emily, confusion and betrayal swirling in his expression. I watched as he struggled to find words, his voice tinged with disbelief. He didn't need to finish the sentence for me to know what he was asking. He was asking why she hadn't told him the truth. Janet spoke, her voice sharp with venom. She told him that Emily had lied to him, to all of them. The words echoed in the space, hanging in the air like a storm that hadn't yet finished building. The man stood there, unable to move, caught in a sudden web of realization. His hand instinctively went to his chest, as if he could somehow make sense of it all. He thought they had something. The pain in his expression twisted in my gut, because I knew exactly how he felt. The sense of betrayal was something I was all too familiar with. I turned back to Emily, my eyes narrowing as I struggled to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to hear any more excuses. I couldn't. I asked her quietly, my voice thick with disgust, if this was what she had wanted. If she wanted to tear everything apart and lie to everyone around her. Her lips trembled, her hands shaking as she finally looked up, her eyes swimming with guilt. But even as she opened her mouth to speak, Janet cut her off again. Janet's voice shook with anger as she turned to me. She told me that this was it, that this was what Emily had been doing all along, and now she had brought him here too. Janet added that Emily didn't care about anyone but herself. The man's face was pale, his eyes darting between the two of us. He was lost now, utterly lost in this mess that had nothing to do with him. And yet, he was just as tangled in it as the rest of us. I saw it in the way he stood there, trying to figure out where he fit into all of this. But there was no place for him. Not now. Janet's gaze shifted back to Emily, her anger still raw and unforgiving. She told her, in a voice low and dangerous, that Emily better hope he wasn't her next target. Janet added that Emily wasn't fooling anyone anymore. I was done. Done with the lies. Done with the games. Done with trying to hold on to something that wasn't even real anymore. My jaw clenched as I turned to the man, my voice hard as steel. I told him he needed to go. Now. My hand gestured toward the door. He didn't argue. He didn't say anything. He just turned and left, his footsteps fading into the distance. When the door clicked shut behind him, the room fell into an eerie silence. I could hear the distant sound of my own breath, the quiet hum of everything that had been left unsaid. The silence stretched on, almost suffocating. I stood there, my heart thudding in my chest, every muscle in my body tense, as if I was waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. But it didn't come. Instead, the weight of everything settled around us like a thick fog. The lies, the betrayals, the way everything had spiraled out of control. It all hung in the air, thick and painful. Emily sat there, her eyes locked on the floor, her hands still trembling. I wanted to scream at her, to demand that she say something, anything to make sense of all this chaos. But nothing came out of her. Not a word, not even a whisper. She was gone, lost in whatever web of deceit she had woven for herself. The person I had trusted, the woman I had loved, was a stranger sitting in front of me. Janet's anger simmered, but it was different now, colder. The venom had seeped out of her voice, replaced by something more dangerous, resignation. She was done too. Done with Emily, done with the lies, done with trying to make sense of something that had never been whole. Janet's voice was rough, but steady when she finally asked how long it had been. The question wasn't directed at me. It was for Emily. I could see her wince, but still, nothing. No words. No explanations. Just the quiet, broken hum of a life shattering apart. I looked at Janet, my eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, we both understood. We both knew the answer before the question had even been fully asked. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except the truth that was already out in the open, and Emily wasn't going to give it. She was too lost in her own lies, too trapped in whatever world she had built to protect herself. I could feel my pulse racing, the anger that had been simmering for hours threatening to boil over. But I swallowed it down. There was no point in yelling anymore. There was no point in begging for explanations that would never come. I turned away from Emily, my heart heavy, and walked toward the window. I needed air. I needed to think, even if my thoughts were nothing but a blur of confusion and pain. I could still feel the tension in the room, the way it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. From the corner of my eye, I saw Janet's hand twitch, but she didn't move. She was still watching Emily, her eyes like daggers. I could tell she wanted to say more, wanted to lash out, but she was done. She knew this was over. We both knew it. Finally, Emily spoke, but it wasn't what I was expecting. She whispered an apology, her voice barely audible. She didn't mean for any of this to happen, but I wasn't sure I could believe that anymore. I froze, the words cutting through the silence like a blade. I repeated her words in my head, still unable to grasp what she was saying. I couldn't hold back the shock and confusion. I asked her, my voice trembling with disbelief, what all of this had meant. How could she say she didn't mean it after everything that had happened? She flinched at my words, her eyes welling up with tears that she hadn't let fall before. It was as if she was struggling to grasp the enormity of what she had done, but she couldn't. She couldn't make sense of the mess she had created, and neither could I. I let out a bitter laugh, but it didn't feel like laughter. It was hollow. I asked her, my voice rising despite myself, if she really wanted to apologize now, after everything, after all the lies, after she'd dragged all of us into this mess. Her face crumpled at my words, but there was nothing left for her to say. The apology was empty. The damage had been done, and no words could undo it now. The trust, once so solid, was shattered. And once trust was gone, nothing could bring it back. I turned to Janet, my voice cold and distant, as if I were speaking from a place far away, removed from all the pain. I told her that we should leave, my words coming out in a slow, deliberate drawl. It felt like I was detached from everything happening around me, just wanting to escape. Janet didn't argue. She didn't need to. We both knew this wasn't something that could be fixed. There was no coming back from this. There was no more to say. As we walked toward the door, I glanced at Emily one last time. Her face was tear-streaked, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her own guilt. But there was no sympathy left in me, no forgiveness, not right now. The door clicked shut behind us, and the sound felt like finality. The last echo of a relationship that had crumbled to dust. We left the house in silence, the weight of what had just happened heavy in the air between us. We didn't need to talk. We both knew. We both understood. The truth had come out, and now there was nothing left but the aftermath.